Presiding Member, Pro-Chancellor Emeritus Professor Terry Campbell, Duty Deans Professor Lisa Sargent of the UNSW Business School, and Scientia Professor Vlado Perkovic, Dean of Medicine and Health, distinguished guests, graduating students and families. At this graduation ceremony, I acknowledge the Bedigal people who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we are gathered, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Well done, you did it. Give yourselves a round of applause. And under quite unprecedented conditions of the last couple of years, extra specially well done. Whether you are graduating today from the business school or with a medicine and health degree, you are also embarking on your journey as leaders in your communities. And it is in that capacity that I wish to address you today. You are leaders with capacity, energy, and capability to make the world a better place through coordinated action. And in this context of impactful coordinated action, I thought about what was the most important thing I could speak to you about today. Put simply, today, it is the Bedigal people and the other traditional custodians of the lands around Australia who I believe best deserve our coordinated action right now. I can't quite believe that it's been 30 years since I first walked this same campus for the first year of my Commerce Law degree. That year, 1992, was a coming-of-age moment for me as I entered adulthood, but it was also a watershed moment for Australia, the significance of which has only grown with time. See, I was a member of a very unique law school cohort, the last ever class to be taught that the entire legal edifice of Australian law was underpinned by what was then a 204-year-old lie. Terra Nullius, empty land, which held in law that despite all available evidence of 65,000 years of continuing connection, culture and language, that the Indigenous peoples of Australia simply didn't exist. That was the law of the land in 1992. It is because of this doctrine of terra nullius that a constitutional amendment was required and was passed in 1967 to first recognise and count Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders as citizens of Australia. This is the legacy of Australia. I clearly also remember, though, in that first semester of law school, the hope in 1992 of a landmark case started 10 years earlier by Eddie Mabo that had the potential to finally overturn over 200 years of terra nullius. And on the 3rd of June 1992, the High Court of Australia did do exactly that in the famous Mabo case, recognising for the first time in law continuing native title for Indigenous Australians that was backed up in 1993 by the first Native Title Act. Mabo was rightly heralded as a long overdue beginning of the process of reconciling past wrongs to Indigenous Australians. 30 years on, this year we have a unique opportunity to build on this with another change to the Constitution. I know that growing up in Australia in the 1980s, I learned nothing of Indigenous cultures, languages, or history. See, Terra Nullius forgave what became a blanket of silence that perpetuated the exclusion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders from Australian society, as well as the exclusion of the rich Indigenous cultures, knowledge, language and history from mainstream Australian society. And when I looked, I saw this blanket of silence closer to home. Growing up in the 1980s, I also never heard or saw any LGBT perspectives. And growing up gay, but without the language to even discuss the taboo topic, he's a bit of a worry was the euphemism of choice to describe someone gay in my family at the time. I am now forever thankful to Australians for the successful vote on marriage equality, which means that I can now be myself and express myself without fear of exclusion or worse. Now, these experiences compelled me to examine other areas where a blanket of silence obscured participation from mainstream society. You didn't have to look very far to find people with disability similarly under that blanket of silence. Now, my eyes were open to the issue of disability in a big way when I started dating a deaf guy, Alex Jones. Alex grew up to deaf parents and deaf grandparents, and American Sign Language was his first proud language. Now, while Alex and I turned out to be better business partners, co-founding AI Media, than romantic partners, our 4 years living together has served me as well as any university degree. I learned Australian Sign Language, Auslan, which is a phenomenal language and super easy to learn because if you don't know a word, you can always fingerspell it and someone will then show you the sign. I became reasonably competent in 6 months, which meant I had this unique opportunity of full immersion with the deaf community, its culture and its language. And that was where I met the amazing Leonie Jackson, my other co-founder at AI Media, whose passion for the criticality of language for all resonated hugely with me. If I couldn't hear, how could I ever have achieved what I have? How could I have acquired the knowledge if I couldn't hear? Yet, Leonie had done exactly that. Leonie's passion for languages, plural, underpinned AI Media's growth and success over the past 20 years, including the introduction of live captioning in classrooms to support deaf children to get a mainstream education. Leonie was so grateful always for the exemplary parenting that she had, for the great example of her father Bob and her mum Pat. Bob knew things were stacked against Leonie growing up as a girl who was deaf in Queensland in the 1970s and 1980s. "You'll just have to work harder than other kids," said Bob. At that time, and again, see the parallels with Indigenous languages, the conventional wisdom was that deaf kids need to be taught English and lip read in order to make it in the real world. Anything that distracted from that was dangerous and needed to be banned, especially sign language. And so Leonie was banned from learning sign language as a child. And then she went to university in Brisbane and jumped in to the deaf community. Leonie described this as the biggest aha moment in her life. The richness of the language, the fact that it was so creative, and the fact that it explained concepts that you couldn't explain in English really excited her. One of her favourite Auslan words is "ba-ba." And it's really hard to translate that. But effectively, it's when you see something that's weird, unusual and confusing, but in a kind of questioning and fun way. So if you see something that's just a bit weird, you go, ba. And that word is used so often in Auslan that it makes you think, we should have something like that. And we do. We have Auslan. It's not just for deaf people. Leonie's experience made her a passionate advocate for bilingual deaf education, and from the earliest age. 2 languages are always better than one, and each helps to support the acquisition of the other. The concerted revival of Indigenous languages presents as great an opportunity for all of us. After working at AI Media, Leonie went on in 2015 to become the first deaf CEO of the Deaf Society in New South Wales in its more than 102-year history. Leonie's life was cut tragically short last year when she gave her life to save her 9-year-old son, who was caught in a rip at Congo Beach on the New South Wales south coast, just one day after her 50th birthday. Since Leonie's passing, the impact of her work has continued to grow. Put simply, Leonie understood intimately the connection between language and culture, and that deaf people want to be able to access the mainstream and enjoy their own culture. Bilingualism improves performance in both languages. Learning one language helps the acquisition of the other, but most importantly, any language is better than none. Indeed, the most important thing we can all do is to ensure that every child has a language by the age of 6. The parallels with Indigenous communities who similarly expressed suppression of their languages and cultures was something Leonie was very focused on at the time of her passing, and we continue this work through the foundation we have set up in her name. Leonie Jackson would not tolerate low expectations of kids with disability. While impairment is a fact of life, disability is not. And this distinction between impairment on the one hand and disability on the other is at the heart of the pride of the deaf community. As Alex Jones says on many occasions, there would be no disability inherent in deafness if everyone understood sign language. Let me illustrate with a personal example. When I was 4 years old, it became apparent that I had some kind of impairment, which manifested itself in my relative inability to put coloured blocks on top of each other without them all falling down. My distraught mother would will me on, but the best I could ever do was 3 rather shaky blocks, while the skyscrapers on either side of me soared 8 or 9 brightly coloured stories high. I remember feeling frustrated, upset, isolated and panicked that I was somehow defective, that society clearly valued people who could put lots of blocks on top of each other, and I was clearly not one of those people. And in that moment, my impairment had become a disability. For what seemed like weeks, I remember practicing blocks, an exercise in futility that only heightened the sense of my anxiety, and in the house about my condition. Finally, my mother plucked up the courage to ask her parents for advice on what could be done. I remember one Sunday at my grandparents' place, the response from my Jewish grandfather was pretty simple. No, relax, so he won't be a builder. And I tell this story to illustrate just how fine the line is between impairment and disability when society is not structured to support everyone's relatedness and connectedness. By an accident of history, I live in a society that allows me to contribute fully through my chosen vocation and to rely on others less spatially challenged to build skyscrapers. In the same way that those who don't like to cook can go out to eat, those without financial skills can hire many in this room to help. And for those who can't fly planes, they can still go overseas because the pilot up the front can. And although I still struggle through packing my luggage and loading the dishwasher, by and large my irritations are pretty minor, and my impairment does not shut me out from society. so my impairment does not disable me. Now, this blanket of silence until very, very recently smothered all focus on disability in Australia. Yet after 40 years of tireless campaigning by a few people, a breakthrough in community consciousness suddenly seemed to appear from nowhere. And the NDIS, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, is now a bipartisan bedrock of the Australian social welfare system, despite it being seen as a 10th order issue by successive governments for many decades. Similarly with marriage equality, the moment finally arrived. And in both examples, the NDIS and marriage equality, it served, in Martin Luther King's words, to bend the arc of history towards justice. But to succeed, we need focus, and to come back to what I said at the beginning, coordinated action. The NDIS and marriage equality had their time, and now is the time for us to right the most fundamental of wrongs, to permanently acknowledge that Terra Nullius could not be further from the truth. We have the opportunity to do something meaningful, fair and just, to recognise, to respect and to learn. And when we do lift that blanket of silence, we find millennia of experience, language, as relevant today as they were in the past. Indeed, it appears to me that that insidious blanket of silence, once removed, remains something inherent: pride. Pride that we as a nation can come together to forge something truly unique and something truly new. Pride that we can formally acknowledge in our country and its constitution the disparate traditions of multicultural people, yet recognise the unique and extraordinary wisdom of the cultures of First Nations who have lived in harmony and sustainability on our shared continent for 65,000 unbroken years. The geopolitical realignments currently underway leave you all graduating today facing the most uncertain future in living history. One thing, however, is certain. Whichever way the geopolitical shakeout turns, Australia will be best served in the coming years and decades as a united and proud country where the skills and abilities of all our citizens are valued and included. To do this, we must learn from history. There is pride in dealing with the truth, dealing frankly with the original sin of dispossession and denial, and pride in truth-telling and treaty. We have much to gain and little to lose from a voice to Parliament. This unique moment in history is our chance to help forge a better path, as we have with disability, as we have with marriage equality, and bend that arc of history ever closer to justice by embracing in full the Uluru Statement from the Heart and supporting the proposed constitutional change. Many argue in opposition, focus on the detail. And should this referendum fail, make no mistake, the headlines will not be talking about detail. There's only one shot at this. The issue is frankly not whether they are the best words to insert into the Constitution. The issue is that it is beyond time that the first Australians are seen and recognised in our society that values everyone and the power of our diversity. Among our diversity, however, it is appropriate to acknowledge that we live on a continent whose understanding is deeply ingrained in our continuing Indigenous cultures. The Uluru Statement from the Heart and the proposed voice to Parliament are not about detail. It's a reform that's fundamental and long overdue. The truth is that colonial Australia was built on a lie, Terra Nullius. We now have the chance to forge a new future that recognises the wisdom of our Indigenous forebears. With this graduation, I wish you every success, both personally and professionally. As leaders in our new shared future, I also urge you to campaign and vote yes for change. Thank you very much.